My name is Serena Whitmore. I'm 33 years old, single, and I live alone in a two-bedroom flat in Camden, North London. The second bedroom isn't really a bedroom, it's more of a storage room with delusions of grandeur, but it holds my books and boxes of forgotten ambition. On paper, I'm a fashion journalist. In real life, I'm the family disappointment. Don't get me wrong, I'm not struggling. Not in the way people assume when they hear journalist and fashion in the same breath. I've been published in Vogue twice. I write regular features for The Gloss, and I even did a live segment on BBC Lifestyle once, where I somehow managed not to trip over my own heels. But none of that seems to matter when I go home. Not to them. My family doesn't understand what I do. To my mother, a real job involves a desk, a pension plan, and a man in a suit saying, "Good work," at the end of the day. My sister, Hannah, once joked that I get paid to write about handbags. I laughed at the time. It was easier than explaining the 12-hour days, the last-minute press trips, or the fact that I've had to work twice as hard for half the recognition because I refused to sleep with the right people. My daddy would have understood. He died when I was 24. Sudden cardiac arrest. One moment he was packing for a weekend golf trip, the next he was gone. We weren't even speaking when it happened. I'd just turned down a PR job in Manchester that he'd pulled strings to get me. He called it stable. I called it suffocating. We had an argument, a big one. I said things I can't unsay. And then he was gone. After that, things shifted. My mother, Judith, withdrew emotionally, like someone had unplugged her from the wall. Our house became museum quiet. My older sister Hannah stepped up. She married her university sweetheart, had 2 children, and somehow inherited the role of daughter that makes sense. I was the unpredictable one. The flight risk. The one who wore all black to a garden party and once brought a French girl named Camille home for Christmas just to prove a point, if I'm honest. But here's the thing, I've always known who I was. That doesn't mean I haven't doubted it, just that I felt it deep in my gut, even when no one else did. I knew it when I was 12 and secretly sketching dresses in the back of my chemistry notebook. I knew it when I walked out of that PR office in tears after turning down the job I was supposed to want. And I know it now, even when I feel like a ghost at family functions, floating between conversations I'm not really part of. The truth is, I'm not bitter. Not in the screaming, slamming doors kind of way. I'm tired. Tired of trying to earn respect that was handed to Hannah without question. Tired of pretending I'm not hurt when me our cousin. And my mother's other favorite makes digs about my bohemian lifestyle and charming little flat. Tired of coming to family dinners where I'm the joke nobody admits they're laughing at. And yet I still show up. Every year. Birthdays, Christmas, Mother's Day. I bring wine. I compliment the roast. I ask about their children, their mortgages, their garden upgrades. I sit there, smiling, as they discuss investments I can't afford to make and family gossip I was never privy to. Because somehow, despite everything, I still want in. Not on their money. Not even on their approval, exactly. But on belonging. On being seen, not for who they think I should have been, but for who I actually am. Last week, we had another of those forced family gatherings, my mother's birthday tea. Garden setting, white parasols, cucumber sandwiches, the whole charade. Mia was there, naturally. She showed up late, in a linen jumpsuit and designer sunglasses, talking loudly about her new Tesla. And at one point, as I scrolled through my phone looking for a photo of a new editorial layout I was proud of, she leaned over and said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, "Serena, your screen is literally shattered. Is that even safe? Honestly, you're like a walking metaphor." Everyone laughed. Even my mother smirked. I stared at the photo on my phone, blurry through the cracks, and felt something harden inside me. That was the moment. The quiet click inside your chest when something shifts. Not rage, not even humiliation, just a kind of cold clarity. They would never see me. Not unless I made them. Not unless I showed them something they couldn't ignore. And that's when I remembered the unopened box in my handbag. The newest iPhone. Pro Max. 1 terabyte. Titanium. Already registered. Already insured. In Mia's name. She had no idea it was coming. None of them did. But I'd been planning it for months. Because sometimes the only way to be heard is to give someone exactly what they want and watch what they do with it. And so, this is the story of how I stopped being invisible and started writing my real headline. It was during one of those obligatory family gatherings, the kind where the air is thick with unspoken judgments and the clinking of cutlery masks the underlying tension, that the first real crack appeared not in the porcelain teacups my mother so meticulously arranged, but in the fragile facade of familial harmony I had been desperately trying to maintain. The occasion was my mother's 65th birthday, a milestone she insisted on celebrating with a garden party that screamed understated elegance, white linen tablecloths fluttering in the gentle breeze, a string quartet playing Vivaldi under the gazebo, and a guest list curated to reflect her impeccable social standing. I arrived early, as always, offering to help with the final touches, though my efforts were met with the usual dismissive wave of her manicured hand and a terse, "Serena, darling, do try not to get in the way." As the guests trickled in, I found myself gravitating towards the periphery, engaging in polite small talk with distant relatives and acquaintances, my smile practiced and my laughter measured. It was during one such conversation that Mia, my cousin and perennial thorn in my side, made her grand entrance. Her presence announced by the click of designer heels on the stone pathway and the subtle waft of an expensive perfume I couldn't quite place. "Serena," she exclaimed, air-kissing both my cheeks with a precision that bordered on mechanical. "Still writing about shoes and handbags, are we?" I forced a smile, choosing to ignore the condescension dripping from her words. "Fashion journalism," I corrected gently, and yes, still at it. She laughed, a tinkling sound that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, someone has to do it, I suppose." Before I could respond, she reached for my phone, which I had placed on the table beside me. "Is this yours?" she asked, picking it up and examining the cracked screen with a look of feigned horror. "Darling, this is a relic. How do you manage with this?" I felt a flush creep up my neck, a mix of embarrassment and anger. "It still works," I replied tersely, reaching out to retrieve it. She held it just out of reach, turning it over in her hands. "I mean, I knew you were into vintage, but this is taking it a bit far, don't you think?" The surrounding guests chuckled, some out of genuine amusement, others out of discomfort. I caught my mother's eye across the table, hoping for a lifeline, a reprimand, anything, but she merely sipped her tea, her expression unreadable. "Mia, that's enough," I said, my voice low but firm. "Please give me back my phone." She handed it over with a shrug, unbothered. "Just trying to help, Serena. No need to get so touchy." I took the phone and slipped it into my bag, my hands trembling slightly. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, the incident casting a shadow over the festivities. I went through the motions, smiling when expected, contributing to conversations when prompted, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene over and over, each iteration more painful than the last. Later that evening, as I sat alone in my flat, the silence pressing in on me, I couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. The humiliation, the lack of support from my own mother, the ever-present sense of not belonging, it all coalesced into a heavy weight on my chest. I realized then that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of a deeper, more insidious issue. A family dynamic that had long marginalized me, rendering me invisible unless I served as the butt of a joke or a cautionary tale. I knew something had to change. I couldn't continue to subject myself to this emotional erosion, to allow their words and actions to chip away at my self-worth. But what could I do? Confrontation had never been my forte, and the thought of challenging the status quo filled me with dread. Yet, the alternative, continued silence and passive acceptance, was no longer tenable. As I pondered my next move, my gaze fell upon the unopened box on my desk, the latest iPhone model, purchased weeks ago during a moment of impulsive resolve. I had intended it as a gift for myself, a symbol of self-care and progress. But now, a different idea began to take shape, one that would require courage and a willingness to disrupt the carefully constructed narrative my family clung to. I picked up the box, turning it over in my hands, the weight of it grounding me. Perhaps it was time to rewrite the script, to assert my presence in a way they couldn't ignore. Not through confrontation, but through a gesture that would force them to reevaluate their perceptions and, perhaps, see me not as the perennial outsider, but as someone worthy of respect and consideration. The plan was audacious, unorthodox, and fraught with potential pitfalls. But as I sat there, the glow of the city lights filtering through my window, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't experienced in a long time: empowerment. And with that, I began to plot the first steps of my quiet rebellion. There's a particular kind of silence that follows you home from a family gathering. It's not the comforting quiet of solitude, not the soft hush of a flat when the kettle's cooling and the windows are fogged from tea steam, but a bitter, humming void, a space so loud with everything you didn't say that it scratches at the back of your throat like a cough you keep swallowing. That night, after Mia mocked my phone and my mother watched with that same bland expression she's worn like a mask since my father died, I sat in my flat and replayed the scenes so many times that even the memories began to distort, like film worn thin from too much light. I knew I should let it go, knew that reacting, even inwardly, would be interpreted as oversensitivity, yet again. But how could I not feel something when every small cut felt like it was made along the same old scar? It wasn't just the phone. It never is it? It was that subtle smirk from my sister when Mia said the word relic, like she agreed but wouldn't say so out loud. It was the way everyone laughed, not because it was truly funny, but because it was easier than confronting the discomfort. And most of all, it was the look my mother gave me, not of concern or defense, but of weariness, like she'd long ago decided I was more trouble than I was worth. That look broke something. When people talk about family, they use words like support and unconditional love, but I've always felt like I was sitting at the kids' table even at 33 with plastic cutlery and a diluted version of the truth. My opinions are often met with polite nods, as if I'm speaking a language they don't quite understand but have decided to tolerate out of civility. My achievements, when mentioned, are quickly pivoted away from. And when I do try to speak honestly, to step out from behind the curated version of myself that they seem comfortable with, I'm told I'm making things heavier than they need to be. Or that I always find the negative in everything. I remember one Christmas years after Dad died when I suggested we go around the table and each say something we were proud of. I'd read about the idea in a women's magazine and thought it would be meaningful, healing even. Hannah said she was proud of her daughter's ballet scholarship, Mia spoke about her latest promotion, and when it came to me, I said I was proud of finally securing my byline in Vogue. The room fell quiet for a second, and then my mother, without malice but with chilling precision, said, "Yes, dear, but I meant something real." And everyone laughed. And I laughed too, because what else could I do? But I didn't forget. I carry those moments the way some women carry perfume in their handbags, invisible but always close, a reminder of something too intimate to leave at home. Over time, I began to realize that being part of my family meant performing a version of myself that was easier to digest. I learned to make jokes at my own expense before anyone else could, to downplay my dreams, to dress modestly for family events even though my wardrobe overflowed with pieces that made me feel alive, powerful, me. I learned to smile through comments that chipped away at me like water eroding stone, and to never, ever appear too emotional because emotions, in my family, are messy, unseemly, and, worst of all, inconvenient. The painful truth is that I don't think my family hates Minot exactly. They just don't know me. And I'm not sure they've ever wanted to. I've spent years knocking gently at the doors of their affection, hoping that one day someone would open up and say, "We see you, Serena." Not just the idea of you, not just the echo but the real you. But the knocks go unanswered. The doors remain locked. And the more I stand outside in the cold, the more I begin to wonder if perhaps I'm not meant to be in the house at all. After the phone incident, I didn't speak to anyone for a week, not out of spite, but because I didn't trust my voice not to tremble, and I knew that any crack in my composure would be interpreted as proof of my fragility. Instead, I buried myself in work, covering London Fashion Week like it was a battlefield, not just of style, but of identity. I interviewed designers who spoke in metaphors and models who whispered their exhaustion behind flawless cheekbones, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged not because they knew me, but because they didn't pretend to. But even as I wrote my reviews and edited glossy spreads, I felt that gnawing emptiness, the ache of being unknown by the people who are supposed to know you best. I thought about skipping the next family dinner. I thought about sending a polite message and staying in with a bottle of wine and a bad romantic comedy. But a voice in my head, faint but familiar, said, "If you don't show up, they win." Still, I wondered what exactly would I be showing up for? To be reminded that I'm different? To sit across from Hannah and her perfect life and pretend I don't see the pity in her eyes when she asks how I'm getting on? To watch Mia hold court and bathe in compliments while I'm asked if I've tried online dating again? I began to realize that my hurt wasn't just about exclusion. It was about being tolerated. And no one should have to shrink themselves to be tolerated. Not in their own family. Not in their own skin. Not in their own life. So when I finally picked up the phone, still cracked, still stubbornly functional, and RSVP'd to my mother's next dinner invitation, I did so not out of obligation, but out of preparation. Because this time, I wasn't coming empty-handed. I wasn't coming just to smile and nod and take notes for my therapist. I was coming with a new phone. And the receipt. In Mia's name. Because sometimes, the only way to carve out a place at the table is to build one of your own. I don't think betrayal always arrives like thunder, loud, explosive, immediate. Sometimes it creeps in like fog, slowly obscuring the familiar until one day you realize you've been walking through a different landscape for years without ever noticing how much it's changed beneath your feet. And by the time you look around and try to orient yourself, the landmarks of fairness, inclusion, and love are so far behind you, they feel like something you imagined. The dinner that followed the garden party wasn't anything special, not on the surface, anyway, but for me, it was another page in a long, quietly cruel novel I never agreed to be a character in. My mother had invited everyone over for what she called a simple Sunday meal. Though of course nothing my mother does is ever truly simple. There were roasted parsnips with thyme and honey glaze. A lamb shoulder she insisted was just a little thing she threw together. And Hannah brought one of those two perfect rhubarb tarts that looked like something out of a food magazine, with its lattice top and glistening finish, as if even her desserts had better posture than I did. I arrived with a bottle of red wine, the good kind, the one I knew my mother liked even if she never acknowledged it. And I wore a navy silk blouse I'd bought from a vintage boutique in Soho the week before, not too flashy. Not too casual, just the right balance to say, I made an effort without screaming, "Please validate me." But when I walked in, I barely got a nod. Mia was already there, curled into the corner of the sofa like she owned the place, her shoes kicked off, one leg tucked under the other, holding court with a story about her recent trip to the Amalfi Coast and the unexpectedly charming Italian man who had tried to whisk her off on a Vespa tour of the coastline. My mother laughed, genuinely, the way she never did with me, and Hannah chimed in about her own European honeymoon, and I stood there for a moment like a misplaced piece in someone else's jigsaw puzzle, unsure of where to sit or how to begin participating in a life that seemed to have moved on without me. The wine went unopened. At dinner, my mother handed out envelopes, thin, cream-colored ones that bore her meticulous cursive. "Just something I've been sorting through," she said lightly. "A little early estate planning. Nothing dramatic." Hannah opened hers immediately, as did Mia, and I saw their eyes flick over the contents with the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing you'll be taken care of. I opened mine and felt the weight before I even read the words. I wasn't written out entirely, but it was close. The family cottage in Cornwall where we'd all spent our summers as children, where Dad taught me how to sail and told me stories under the stars, was being left to Hannah. The trust fund my father had set up for his grandchildren was now in Mia's hands to manage, since she has a more stable lifestyle. The artwork my father's collection, pieces he used to walk me through slowly, explaining brushstrokes and light was to be auctioned and divided, with specific paintings marked for Hannah's house and a vague mention of any remainder going to me. It wasn't just about the things, though God knows the things hurt. It was about the message: you do not belong to this legacy. You are not central here. You are tolerated, footnoted, and just barely remembered. I said nothing during the meal. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, as if my own body was conspiring against me to maintain the illusion of calm. I smiled, nodded, made sounds of polite understanding. I complimented the lamb. I asked about the children. I offered to help clear the plates. But inside, I was unraveling, thread by invisible thread. After dessert, when most of the guests had moved into the sitting room for coffee, I stayed behind in the kitchen, scrubbing a pan that didn't really need scrubbing, just to give myself a moment alone. And then I heard voices, faint through the door. "She's just never really fit in," Mia was saying. "I mean, I'm not trying to be cruel, but let's be honest, Serena's always been a bit fringe. You have to understand," my mother replied, and her voice was lower, tired. "She's difficult. It's not malicious, but it's exhausting. The moods, the sensitivity, the constant pushing back. Hannah's easy. You're easy. Serena always has to make everything about her." I stood there, the water running over my fingers, not hot enough to scald but just sharp enough to keep me upright. And I realized in that moment that there was no role for me in this family that didn't involve diminishing myself. If I stayed silent, I was irrelevant. If I spoke up, I was too much. If I succeeded, it was a fluke. If I struggled, it was proof I'd made poor choices. There was no version of me they wanted, only one they could contain. That night, back in my flat, I poured myself a glass of the unopened wine and sat at my desk, staring at the unopened box, the iPhone, still in its packaging, still registered in Mia's name. I thought about returning it. I thought about donating it. But most of all, I thought about what it would mean to give it to her, not as a peace offering, not as a gift, but as a mirror. A mirror to reflect who they were. A receipt, not just for the purchase, but for the years I'd spent paying in silence. They had taken so much without ever asking. My trust, my inheritance, my place at the table. And now, I had something they didn't see coming, not revenge, not cruelty, but clarity. And clarity, I was learning, was a kind of power. In the days that followed that dinner, I found myself caught between two instincts: retreat and defiance, between the ache to disappear entirely, to stop showing up for people who never noticed when I was hurting, and the burning need to stand taller, louder, clearer than ever, even if my voice shook and my heart bruised with every attempt to be visible in a family that had mastered the art of pretending I wasn't there. It's strange how hope clings to you even after it's been smothered, how it creeps back in like sunlight through closed curtains, soft at first, then persistent, as if some part of you refuses to accept that this is all there is. I told myself maybe they just didn't understand me. Maybe they weren't malicious, just distracted. Maybe if I tried harder, if I found the right words, the right tone, the right moment, they'd see me not as a disruption or an embarrassment, or the perpetual question mark at the end of their otherwise neat sentences, but as Serena, their sister, their daughter, their equal. So I tried. God, did I try. I invited Hannah to lunch at a quiet place in Islington, the kind with exposed brick walls and artisan coffee that I thought might impress her without being too quirky, and I wore something elegant, something polished in emerald blouse and tailored black trousers, with my hair pulled back the way my mother always said made me look more professional. I wanted to talk not about the past, not about the inheritance, but about now, about us, about the gap between our lives and the possibility of building a bridge over it. But halfway through my carefully composed speech about wanting to be closer, to understand her world and let her into mine, she interrupted to check her phone, murmuring something about a school pickup, and when she looked back up, she smiled with a softness that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "Serena, I think you overthink things. We all love you, you know that. Maybe just Stop taking everything so personally. And I nodded, because arguing would have ruined the meal, and I was still clinging to the idea that civility might lead to connection if I just held on to it long enough. The next week, I offered to help Mom organize the charity auction she was hosting for her bridge club, thinking that maybe if she saw me as useful, involved, competent, something might shift. I poured hours into designing the event brochure, contacting vendors, organizing the wine list. I even stayed up until 2 in the morning designing a digital invitation that she could send to her friends with a personalized RSVP tracker. I thought she'd be impressed, maybe even grateful. But when I brought it all to her, printed and arranged in a neat folder, she glanced at it and said, "Oh, this is nice, but I think Mia's already taking care of most of it. She has a better feel for these sorts of things." I stood there, folder in hand, throat closing slowly like a door on a room I thought I'd been invited into, and all I could say was, "Right, of course." She didn't mean to wound me, I think. That's part of what makes it harder. The casualness of it. The way your heart can be quietly crushed by someone who thinks they're offering you kindness just by not telling you to leave. But still, I kept showing up. Because I was trying to build something not just for them to see, but for me, something that proved I hadn't given up on the possibility of connection, of value, of being recognized not just by strangers who read my bylines or followed my Instagram, but by the people who watched me grow up and still couldn't name the color of my eyes without checking a photograph. And there were glimmers. Sometimes moments so brief. I almost missed them, like when Aunt Claire pulled me aside after a gathering and said she'd read my piece on sustainable fashion in The Observer and had shown it to her Pilates group, or when my younger cousin Emily messaged me to ask for advice on starting her own blog, saying she wanted to write like me. I clung to those moments like lifelines, trying to stitch together a sense of worth from scraps of recognition that came too late and too far between. And then, there was the interview. A contact of mine, a producer from a podcast about women in media, reached out asking if I'd be willing to speak about my career, my voice, and the way I navigated spaces that didn't always welcome loud, opinionated women. I almost said no. I almost convinced myself I wasn't qualified. But something stronger than fear answered yes, and I found myself in a studio 3 weeks later, headphones on, voice trembling as I spoke my truth into a microphone, unsure if anyone would even listen. But people did listen. The episode got shared. My social media lit up. I got messages from strangers, young women, older women, women who said things like, "Thank you for saying what I've never had the words for, and you made me feel less alone." I waited for someone in my family to mention it. No one did. Not my mother. No Tana. Not Mia. It was as if it never happened. And that, more than anything, was the moment I realized the mountain I was trying to climb wasn't just tall, it was imaginary. A trick of perspective. A game they never intended to let me win, because the rules were always changing and the finish line was always moving. And so, I started moving, too. Not away, but forward. I stopped asking for permission to be seen. I stopped shrinking myself to fit into their frame. I stopped hoping that love would look like acknowledgement, and instead, began to love myself out loud, in ways they couldn't ignore, even if they refused to name it. Because there is a kind of recognition that begins not with applause or validation, but with silence broken by your own voice, finally steady, finally sure, saying, "I am here. And I matter." Even if you never say it back. The next confrontation didn't arrive like a storm. It came on an evening wrapped in the illusion of civility, under the soft, golden glow of candles and chandeliers, with linen napkins folded into elegant shapes and water glasses filled exactly 3/4 of the way to the rim. The kind of evening that masquerades as family but feels more like theater, where every glance carries subtext and every silence has a weight too heavy for the room. It was Hannah who suggested the dinner, just us, she said. No cousins, no kids, just a proper meal between sisters and Mum. A chance to reconnect, as she called it in her text, though the word felt like it had been scrubbed of meaning, polished to the point of sterility, and I almost declined. Almost claimed a work commitment or a migraine or anything that might excuse me from walking back into a space where I'd so often been invisible, but something in me was curious, even defiant, and so I said yes. We met at a restaurant in Kensington, the sort of place with low lighting and quiet service, where conversations are private and plates arrive like works of art. And as soon as I walked in and saw my mother already seated, menu unopened, Hannah sipping a gin and tonic with that same easy grace she'd always possessed, I knew this wasn't going to be the warm reunion I might have once hoped for. They smiled, of course. They asked about work. They complimented my blouse, though my mother said, "You always wear such dark colors." As if mourning was a fashion statement and not an emotional state I'd learned to hide beneath silk and structure. I played along, I ordered wine, I asked about the children and the new conservatory extension at Hannah's house, and for a few moments, it almost felt normal almost. Until it didn't. Until the food arrived and the conversation shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Mum leaned forward, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision, and said, "Serena, darling, we've been talking, and we think it might be a good idea if you, perhaps spoke to someone." I looked up, confused. Someone? "A therapist," Hannah clarified, as if the word needed her permission. "You've been under a lot of stress lately." I stared at them, the fork frozen in my hand, and something inside me began to swell, not rage exactly, but a heat, a pressure, the way a dam must feel right before it breaks. "What makes you think I need therapy?" I asked, my voice low, controlled. They exchanged glances, the kind that say, "We've discussed this already, she's being difficult again," and my mother sighed, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It's just your reactions lately. The phone incident, the inheritance. You've become quite sensitive. And then there was that podcast you did." My pulse spiked. "What about it?" "It was very raw," Mum said carefully. "Public. You said things that made us all look rather cold. I didn't use your names. You didn't have to." And there it was. Not concern. Not care. Just embarrassment. Just the irritation of a curtain being pulled back too far. Just the discomfort of someone else finally narrating the story. "I told the truth," I said quietly. "My truth." You made it sound like we abandoned you," Hannah said, her voice tighter now, her carefully composed calm beginning to fray. "We've always included you." "No," I said, the word falling like a stone in a still pond. "You've tolerated me. You've smiled at me and spoken around me and asked about my work like it's a hobby. You've handed out affection like ration cards, and I'm always the last one in line." That's not fair," Mum said sharply, the mask slipping just enough for me to see the crack beneath it. "You've always been difficult, Serena. Always. Even as a child, you never knew when to let things go. I learned that from you." The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched across the table, through the flicker of candlelight and the slow jazz murmuring in the background, and for a moment, I felt like I had stepped entirely out of my body and was watching myself speak with a clarity and conviction I hadn't known I possessed. "You think I'm broken," I said, not as a question but a realization, one I had carried for too long. "You think because I cry easily and fight for my place and won't laugh when Mia mocks me that I'm unstable. But you know what's unstable? Pretending to be fine in a family that only loves the parts of you that are easy to digest." My voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Every word landed with the weight of years. Hannah pushed her plate away. "This is exactly what I mean. Everything becomes a performance with you. A drama. Can't we just have one meal without turning it into a scene?" "No," I said. "Because I'm done pretending. I'm done swallowing the pain just to make you comfortable." "No." My mother looked at me, then really looked at me, and, for the first time, I saw something shift in her expression, something that looked like fear or maybe recognition, but it passed too quickly for me to be sure. I stood, gathering my coat with hands that only trembled slightly. "I'm not the fragile one," I said. "I'm just the one who finally stopped lying." "Allo." And with that, I walked out, Past the waiter with the dessert tray, past the couple laughing in the corner, past the warm glow and the glass facade and into the cold London night where the air bit sharp against my cheeks but tasted, for the first time in years, like freedom. The walk home that night felt longer than it should have, the streets of London blurring into a watercolor of headlights and wet pavement, every footstep echoing louder than the one before it. As if the city itself were trying to remind me just how alone I was, just how small I had become in the wake of that confrontation, where I'd finally spoken the truth and found that the silence that followed was not a pause for reflection but a door quietly closing behind me. It wasn't dramatic, the fallout not at first. There were no shouting matches, no weeping phone calls, no attempts to drag me back into the fold with teary apologies or promises to do better. There was just nothing. No messages from Hannah, no call from Mum, not even a passive-aggressive group chat update that I'd been excluded from. It was as if I had disappeared, erased gently but thoroughly. Like chalk washed off a blackboard, no trace of me left behind, except for the faint outline of what had once been there. And for a while, I told myself I didn't care. For a while, I leaned into the silence like it was a kind of power, convincing myself that distance was cleansing, that space would give me strength, that solitude wasn't punishment but protection. But the truth is, it wore me down, slowly, methodically, the way water hollows stone, not with force but with time. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being physically alone, but from being emotionally discarded, from realizing that the people you spent your whole life trying to please never truly wanted you to be whole, only quiet, manageable, small, and that kind of loneliness settles in your bones, in your skin, in the creases beneath your eyes where laughter used to live. I stopped writing for a few weeks. Deadlines came and went, emails piled up, my editor left voicemails that I didn't return. I told myself I was just tired, that I needed rest, but the truth was, I had nothing to say. My voice, the one I had fought so hard to strengthen, felt brittle now, like glass stretched too thin, and every attempt to write ended in blank pages and a blinking cursor that felt like it was mocking me. Even my flat, once a sanctuary, started to feel too quiet, too still. Like the rooms were whispering reminders of all the times I'd come home from a family gathering with tears I didn't let fall until the door was closed. I started sleeping on the sofa again, not because the bed was uncomfortable, but because it felt too big, too empty, too filled with the ghost of a version of me that still believed love could be earned if you just tried hard enough. The unopened phone sat on the desk like a monument to an idea I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. It mocked me not because of what it was, but because of what I had thought it could mean. A symbol, a gesture, a way to reclaim something. But now it just looked like another thing I had invested hope into, only to be met with indifference. There was one night 4 weeks after the dinner when the weight of everything finally pressed too hard, when the silence became too sharp, when the ache became too loud. I had been staring at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep, unable to cry, just stuck, frozen in that hollow space between anger and grief. And I got up, walked barefoot into the kitchen, poured a glass of wine and sat on the floor in the dark, hugging my knees like a child, and whispered into the silence, "Why wasn't I enough?" The words surprised me. Not because I hadn't thought them before, but because saying them aloud made them real, made them undeniable, made them echo back at me with a cruelty I couldn't escape. And then the dam broke. Not in some cinematic flood of sobs, but in slow, quiet tears that rolled down my cheeks like they had nowhere else to go. And I sat there in that cold kitchen, wrapped in shadows and sorrow, finally allowing myself to feel all the things I'd been burying under strength and pride and performance. It was the loneliest I had ever felt. But it was also, strangely, a kind of release. Because once the grief had passed through me, I had let it sit with me like an old friend who didn't need to be fixed or dismissed. I realized something else. I was still here. Still breathing. Still standing. Still Serena. And slowly, very slowly, that meant something. The next morning, I woke up on the kitchen floor, stiff and hollow, but something had shifted. I made coffee. I opened my laptop. I stared at a blank document for 20 minutes and then I wrote a single sentence. There are rooms you will never be welcomed into, but you can still build your own house. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that day, I opened the drawer and took out the phone, peeled off the wrapping, held it in my hand for a long time. It was sleek, new, powerful, and in Mia's name. I looked at the receipt, still tucked in the box, and thought about what I had wanted it to symbolize, what I had hoped it would say. And I realized. It still could. But not in the way I first imagined. Because I wasn't trying to punish her. I was trying to tell the truth. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to speak it, not for them, not to earn anything, but because it was mine, and because it mattered. Even if no one was listening. Even if the only ears were my own. Sometimes the truth comes not with a scream, but with the quiet rustle of paper, soft, unassuming, deceptively light for how much it carries, and when it arrives, it doesn't necessarily explode your world in one grand cinematic rupture, but rather unthreads it stitch by careful stitch until you look around one day and realize that everything you believed was whole had been unraveling for years. It started with a letter, an actual letter, which in itself felt strange and out of time, like a relic from another life found not in the mail, but tucked in the back of my father's old leather satchel, the one I had insisted on keeping after he died, even though my mother said it was worn and smelt like old newspapers, but I had always loved the way it felt in my hands, like something permanent, something grounded, something real. I hadn't touched the satchel in years, but in a moment of impulse, perhaps guided by something I still don't understand, I pulled it out from under my bed where it had been buried among boxes of old photographs and university essays and yellowing notebooks filled with dreams I've been too tired to chase. I opened it absent-mindedly, running my fingers along the cracked edges, and that's when I saw it. A white envelope, aged at the corners, unsealed, addressed in my father's handwriting to my girls. My heart stuttered. It wasn't dated, just folded neatly. Inside were 2 pages of lined stationery, written in his distinct, looping cursive, the kind I used to try to imitate as a child, convinced that if I could just write like him, maybe I could understand the way he saw the world. I read it slowly, carefully, each word like a pulse beneath my skin. He wrote about the cottage in Cornwall, about how he wanted it to be a shared space, a sanctuary for both his daughters, a place where Hannah and Serena can build new memories, where they are equals, not rivals, not roles, not reflections of other people's expectations. He spoke of his artwork, how he had collected not for value but for meaning, and how he hoped Serena would keep the pieces that meant the most to her, because she sees things differently. And sometimes that's the very gift this family needs most. And then, at the bottom of the second page, came the twist I hadn't seen coming. He wrote, "If for any reason my wishes aren't followed, if grief or convenience or misguided assumptions interfere, Serena has every right to question, to ask, to reclaim what I left behind for both my daughters, not just the one who stayed close." My breath caught. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt slightly off axis, like I'd been walking at an angle for so long that straightening suddenly felt unnatural. I read it again, and again, and slowly, the contours of the truth came into view. The will my mother had referenced at that dinner, the one that divided things so cleanly, so decisively, wasn't aligned with what he had written in his own hand. Something had shifted. Something had been changed. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that my own mother could override his wishes, could so casually erase my part in his legacy, could diminish me in ways that went beyond emotional coldness and into the realm of legal, tangible betrayal. But how could I deny it now? The letter was proof. Not just of his intent, but of the love he had carried, from a love that had never made it past the threshold of my mother's careful curation of memory. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The way Mum had deflected when I asked questions about the estate. The way she had refused to discuss the original documents, claiming it was too painful. The way Hannah always looked so sure, so relaxed in her ownership of our father's legacy, while I was left piecing together fragments and ghosts. I should have been furious, and part of me was, but what I felt more than anything in that moment was grief. Not just for my father, not just for what was taken, but for all the years I'd spent blaming myself, questioning my worth, doubting my place in a family that had quietly edited me out of the narrative. And yet, even in that grief, something stronger began to stir. Because now I had something solid. Not just emotion. Not just memory. But truth. And I was done hiding. The next morning, I called a solicitor. I explained the situation, scanned and sent the letter, outlined everything I knew or suspected. She listened carefully, asked questions I hadn't thought to ask, and when I hung up, my hands were trembling, but not from fear. From adrenaline, from clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about the cottage or the paintings or the money. It was about something deeper, something older, something primal, the right to be seen, to be counted, to be acknowledged not as a problem or a disappointment, but as a daughter. That afternoon, I sat at my desk, the new phone beside me, still unused, and I opened my laptop to draft an email. It was to Mia. I kept it brief, professional, devoid of the bitterness I had every right to wield. Hey Mia, I'm writing to let you know that the new iPhone you mocked me for not having was, ironically, purchased for you. It's registered in your name. The receipt is enclosed. I was going to give it to you in person, but things have shifted. I don't expect a thank you. But I do expect you to know what that gesture meant. Sirena. I attached a scan of the receipt. I didn't wait for a response. Then, I sent another email, this time to Hannah and my mother. I told them I had discovered Dad's letter. I told them I had sought legal counsel. I told them this was not about creating drama, but about correcting an injustice. And I ended it with one line. I will no longer be erased. I expected panics. I expected rage. But what I received, within an hour, was silence. A deep, echoing silence that told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't expected me to fight. They had never imagined I would. But I was. Not to destroy them, but to save myself. It began, not with anger, but with a request, simple, direct, impossible to ignore, sent in a plain text to my mother and sister on a Wednesday morning. The kind of day where the sky was the color of paper and the wind carried the bite of late March. A day that felt transitional in all the ways I did too. We need to talk. All of us. Sunday, at the house. No excuses. I didn't expect a warm response, and I didn't get one. My mother replied with a curt, I suppose, and Hannah's was even colder, just a thumbs-up emoji that somehow carried more resentment than a full sentence might have. Mia didn't reply at all, which wasn't surprising, but I knew she'd be there, because Mia never missed a chance to look unbothered by things that deeply mattered. The house hadn't changed, same prim hedges, same pale blue door. Same polished brass knocker I'd slammed in every mood between childlike excitement and furious grief, but something about stepping into it this time felt different, like I had finally crossed a threshold, no longer arriving as the daughter who needed approval but as the woman who was done asking for it. They were already seated when I walked in, three of them like a panel, mum in her beige cardigan, Hannah in a blazer that said she'd come prepared for battle, and Mia in oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy day. Lounging like she was at a cafe in Milan, not the living room where my father used to read to me on rainy afternoons. I didn't sit right away. I placed the folder I was carrying gently on the coffee table, removed the letter from inside Dad's letter, the one I'd found tucked away in his satchel, and laid it out like evidence, like the final piece of a puzzle they had all pretended didn't exist. I found this last month, I said, my voice low but steady, and I didn't bother to hide the tremble in it because I wasn't afraid of feeling anymore, not in front of them, not now. It's from Dad. A letter he wrote to all of us, outlining what he wanted for the house, for the cottage in Cornwall, for the artwork, everything. Mum glanced at it, not picking it up, not touching it, just staring as if proximity might infect her with the guilt she had managed to suppress for so long. Hannah took it, brows narrowing as she read, flipping quickly from the first page to the second. Mia didn't move. It's not legally binding, Mum said finally, her voice clipped. A letter doesn't override a will, Serena. You're intelligent, you should know that. I nodded, slowly. It may not override it. but it casts doubt on the intent behind the changes, and that's what I'm challenging. You're challenging the will? Hannah's voice was incredulous, sharp with disbelief that I'd dare interrupt the narrative they'd all agreed to behind my back. Yes, I said. And I've already retained a solicitor. She's reviewed the letter, she's looked into the timeline of the will revisions, and she's preparing a case to bring forward. Unless, I paused, letting the word breathe, letting the implication land, we resolve this civilly. You're blackmailing us? Mia asked, finally pulling off her glasses. Her eyes were narrowed, but beneath the performative outrage, I saw its uncertainty. Fear. Because of a letter? No, I said softly. Because for the last 10 years, I have been erased. And now I am writing myself back in. Mum stood, smoothing her cardigan as if that could smooth over the years of exclusion, betrayal, favoritism etched into every polite dismissal she ever offered. This is absurd, she said. You've always been dramatic, Serena. This letter doesn't prove anything. It proves that Dad saw me, I said. It proves that he wanted both of his daughters to share in what he built. It proves that someone either through convenience or deliberate choice decided to ignore that. He never changed the will on his own, I added, this time looking directly at her. Did he? Her lips tightened, but she didn't speak. And silence, in that moment, was everything. I was supposed to have a share of the cottage, I said, pacing now because I couldn't keep still, couldn't contain the years of anger pressing against my ribs like fists. He wanted me to keep certain pieces of his art. He wanted us to be equals, but that never fit your version of how things should be, did it? You never saw me as equal. I was the difficult one. The disappointment. The daughter who lived alone in a flat and wore the wrong clothes and didn't marry and didn't give you grandchildren and didn't play along. No, I said, turning to Hannah now. You did everything right. You married well. You had the children. You stayed close. You were palatable. And because of that, you were rewarded. That's not fair, Hannah snapped, her voice breaking. You chose your path. I chose truth, I said. And I was punished for it. For a moment, no one spoke. And then Mum said something so soft I almost didn't hear it. You don't understand the pressure I was under. After he died, things were chaos. I was scared. You were scared, I repeated, and I could feel tears rising now, but I didn't stop them. And instead of leaning on the daughter who needed you, you shut me out. You restructured the will to make things easier. But easier for who? Silence. You lied, I whispered. I protected what I thought was best, she said. Hannah was stable. You were unsteady. No, I said. I was grieving. And there it was. The truth in its purest form. The thing I had carried alone for years. I had been grieving, and in my grief, I had been punished. In my pain, I had been labeled. In my truth, I had been deemed inconvenient. I don't want everything, I said, my voice breaking now. I don't want to burn it down. I want what he meant for me to have. I want my place back. Not for the money, not for revenge. For him, and for me. And they didn't respond. But they didn't argue. And maybe that was the beginning. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic gavel strike, no weeping confessions, no moment where my mother clutched her chest and begged for forgiveness. But there was a slow, deliberate shift, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface, reshaping the landscape of our family in a way that could no longer be ignored or undone. And I felt it in every silence that followed my confrontation, in every unread text message, in every heavy pause when someone said my name. The solicitor filed the claim 3 weeks after that meeting, attaching the letter, the dates, the discrepancies between the will and the timeline of its revision, and with each passing day, the reality of what I had done began to crystallize not just in their minds, but in mine. This wasn't just about the cottage or the paintings or the money anymore. It was about the act of reclaiming a life, about unburying the self I had been forced to suppress for the comfort of others. Hannah was the first to reach out, not with an apology, but with a question. Do you really want to take this to court? She sounded tired, brittle, like someone whose certainty had finally cracked. Mum's not sleeping. She's devastated. And I told her the truth not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I was done softening the blow for people who never cushioned mine. I'm not the one who changed the will. I'm the one who was written out of it. If Mum's devastated, it's because she knows what she did. And because she finally sees that I'm not the one who disappears. For the first time in my life, Hannah didn't have a comeback. And then came Mia. She sent a text, just one line. "So, am I supposed to return the phone now?" I didn't respond, not because I didn't have something to say, but because she didn't deserve the oxygen of my reply. Let her sit with the irony of that question. Let her hold the symbol of her own cruelty, still polished and new in her hand, unaware that the receipt she once mocked was now proof of my power. But the real reversal came in the form of an offer. My solicitor received a call from Mum's legal team. They wanted to settle, though they never used the word apology, never conceded wrongdoing, just misunderstandings and poor communication, as though 20 years of silence and strategic erasure could be dismissed with corporate phrasing. Still, they proposed terms: a shared title on the Cornwall cottage, an agreed division of the artwork, and a formal written acknowledgement that the changes to the will did not reflect the full intent of the deceased. I sat with that email for hours. Not because I doubted my next move, but because I knew what accepting would mean. It would mean closure. It would mean legitimacy. It would mean recognition. But it would also mean the end of something, the end of my illusion that they would ever love me in the way I deserved. The end of trying to fit into a house that was built to exclude me. And yet, I accepted. Because some battles are not won through destruction, but through reclamation. Because sometimes the quiet act of being seen is the loudest victory of all. The day the papers were signed, I stood in the kitchen of my flat, the same kitchen where I had once collapsed to the floor and whispered, "Why wasn't I enough?" And I brewed a cup of tea and sat at my tiny table and read the acknowledgement letter aloud to no one but myself, letting each word land like a blessing I had written in blood and silence. Later, I drove to the cottage. It was spring now, and the coast smelled like salt and damp earth, and the windows were fogged with the breath of history. I unlocked the door, my door. No one stepped inside. Everything was exactly as I remembered. And nothing was. Because now, it belonged to me, too. I wandered through each room slowly, fingers trailing along the banister my father had once repaired with his own hands, eyes lingering on the sea-worn photographs and dog-eared books. And when I reached the back room, the one that had always felt like mine even when I had no claim to it, I sat down and cried, not with sadness, not with grief, but with the profound, aching relief of someone who has finally been allowed to take up space. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. From my mother. The handwriting was careful, formal. Serena. I didn't know how to say this in person, and maybe I still don't. I made mistakes. Some of them were practical. Some were personal. I was afraid of losing control after your father died, and I tried to hold everything together by choosing what was predictable. You were never predictable. You were vivid. And I didn't know how to love vividness without feeling like I might disappear. I'm sorry, Mum. It wasn't enough. But it was something. And when I placed the letter in the drawer alongside Dad's, I realized that even though I had fought this battle to win something external, something legal, something tangible, I had also won something else. Something I hadn't dared to name. My voice, not just heard, but felt. They would never see me the way I had once longed for. But they would know me now. And that, at last, was enough. It's strange, really, the way life settles into itself after a storm, not suddenly, not neatly, not with the kind of cinematic clarity we grow up believing in, but slowly, gently, as if the universe itself is still holding its breath, waiting to see if you've really made it through. Waiting to see if this piece you've carved out for yourself will hold or collapse beneath the weight of everything you had to break to get here. After the settlement was finalized and the paperwork signed, there were no dramatic declarations, no family dinners to mark a new beginning. No teary apologies or group hugs that might have made for a better story, just space and quiet, and a hollow sense of fatigue that lingered in my chest for days, like the last remnant of a fever I couldn't quite shake. But beneath the fatigue was something else: relief, maybe even contentment, though I was too cautious to name it then, too newly unburdened to believe it could last. I returned to the Cornwall cottage, not out of spite, not to make a statement, but because it felt like the only place where I could breathe again without every inhale reminding me of all the years I'd been choking on silence. It was late spring when I arrived, the kind of soft, misty afternoon where the sea glistened under a pale gray sky and the fields rippled with green, and as I stepped out of the car and closed the door behind me, I felt something shift in my chest, not dramatically, but deeply, like the gentle unlocking of a door I hadn't even realized I'd been pushing against. The cottage hadn't changed, not in the ways that mattered. There was still the slightly uneven step leading to the porch, still the faded blue shutters Dad had painted himself one summer when we were kids. Still the scent of old wood and salt lingering in the air like a memory too stubborn to fade. But everything inside me had changed. I wasn't here as a guest or a visitor or the forgotten daughter come to mourn what she couldn't keep. I was here as an owner, a steward of my father's legacy, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I belonged somewhere without needing anyone else to confirm it. I didn't unpack right away. Instead, I walked from room to room in silence, letting my hands drift over the furniture, the banisters, the photographs still hanging slightly crooked on the walls, and I let the memories come, not just the bright ones, but the hard ones too, the ones I used to flinch from. The ones tied to longings and questions I no longer needed answered. In the back bedroom, where I used to read alone during family holidays, I found a box of my father's old books, and I sat on the floor with my legs folded beneath me and leafed through them slowly, not searching for anything, just allowing myself to feel the weight of inheritance in its truest sense, not in titles or deeds, but in paper and ink and the scent of dust and time. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I began to paint again. Not for a gallery, not for social media, not even for myself in the way I used to mean that phrase, but for the girl I had been before all the noise began. Before the roles were assigned and the lines drawn and the quiet war for recognition started tearing me down from the inside. I set up an easel by the window in the small sunroom, where the light fell soft and diffused across the floor, and each morning, after coffee and a quiet walk along the cliffs, I returned to the canvas and let the color speak where words had failed me for so long. Professionally, things were shifting too. After the podcast episode aired and went quietly viral, I began receiving invitations I'd never received before from editors who wanted me to speak at panels, from aspiring journalists asking for mentorship, from readers who said my story had helped them leave marriages, confront parents, apply for jobs they'd been too afraid to reach for. For once, I didn't shrink from the spotlight. I didn't defer or deflect or joke away the praise. I said thank you. I stood in it. I owned it. Back in London, I still kept my flat. It felt necessary, a reminder of the version of me who survived those long nights and cracked ceilings, who wrote articles by candlelight during power outages and returned from family dinners, hollowed out and shaking. That version of me was not weak. She was resilient. She was the reason I made it here. Hannah visited the cottage in early June, alone, without her children, without her carefully curated schedule. She brought flowers, wild ones, not arranged, and she didn't come with a speech or a defense or even a plan. We sat on the porch in near silence for most of the afternoon, sipping tea and watching the tide roll in, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't with apology but with honesty. "I think I resented you because you never played the part," she said. "And I hated you for not needing us the way I needed to be needed." I didn't tell her she was wrong. I didn't even tell her I forgave her. But I said, "Thank you for coming." And that was enough. Mom's letters came once a month, short and cautious, filled with updates about her garden and her bridge club and the neighbors' renovations. There was an apology once, buried in the middle of a sentence, careful and small. I didn't write back often, but I read every word. And over time, I began to feel less like her estranged daughter and more like two people sharing a history, unsure of how to move forward but no longer pretending the past didn't matter. As for Miasha, didn't write, didn't call, didn't show up. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. Some people aren't meant to come with you when you rise. Some people are the lesson, not the legacy. And through it all, I felt something growing in men at rage. Not vindication, but peace, the kind that settles deep in your bones and makes even the quiet feel like music. I had fought for my place, and I had claimed it not just with legal documents or confrontations, but with presence, with persistence, with the radical act of refusing to disappear. This wasn't a happy ending, not in the way stories often offer them. This was a real one. And real endings don't tie themselves neatly. They breathe. They shift. They begin again. I had been buried. Now, I was blooming. If you had asked me years ago what I wanted from my family, what I ached for in the hollowest parts of myself, I would have said the truth, or maybe love, or maybe something even more impossible. To go back, to start again, to be held the way I imagined my mother once held me before I was old enough to understand that some children are born into roles before they ever speak a word, and some roles like mine are quieter, lonelier, easily rewritten by those who are louder, more palatable, more convenient. But now, sitting here in the sunlit room of a house I fought to call mine, surrounded by paintings I no longer feel the need to explain or justify. I realized that what I wanted wasn't love without conflict or a family that always understood might was recognition, the kind that doesn't vanish when you leave the room. The kind that doesn't require performance or apology. The kind that simply says, "You are here, you matter. We see you." It took everything in me to get here, not just courage, but the kind of slow, painful unlearning that leaves you breathless, because shedding what you've been taught to believe about yourself is not a clean process. It's jagged, it's slow, and it hurts in places you didn't even know you could be hurt. But in that process, I found myself. Not the version of me they wanted, not the quiet one, the too sensitive one, the one always on the brink of tears or needing too much, but the version who stood her ground, who spoke even when her voice trembled, who picked up the pen and rewrote the ending. I think back now to that dinner, the one where I stood in that expensive restaurant across from my mother and sister and finally said all the things I'd buried for years, and I no longer replay it with shame or doubt. I see it now for what it was, a line drawn in the sand between who I had been and who I refused to be anymore. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was an awakening, the moment I stopped asking for their approval and started claiming my own worth. And I don't hate them. Not even Mia, who tried so hard to dim my light just to make her seem brighter. I understand now that people operate from their own pain, their own fear, their own sense of scarcity, and that understanding doesn't excuse their behavior, but it frees me from carrying it. I will never be the daughter my mother dreamed of, but I am the daughter my father believed in, and that has to be enough. It is enough. I am not healed in some perfect, Instagrammable way. I still flinch at certain phrases. I still feel that old ache in my chest when I see a family sitting together in a restaurant, laughing with ease, with history, with mutual love. I still wonder, sometimes, what it might have felt like to be held without judgment. But I also know this. I have built something stronger than fantasy. I have built something real. My story is not about revenge. It's not about proving them wrong. It's about proving me right, about trusting that the truth, no matter how quiet or inconvenient, has power. It's about believing that taking up space in this world isn't something you earn by being good or agreeable. It's something you claim with your whole chest, with your whole heart, with your whole complicated self. So if you're reading this, and maybe you are, maybe you've been where I've been, in the shadows of people who never saw your fire or who tried to put it out, I want you to know this: you are not too much. You are not too late. And you do not need to become smaller to be loved. If the people around you can't hold the fullness of who you are, let that be their limitation, not your burden. You can speak. You can fight. You can leave. You can stay and set boundaries. You can grieve what should have been while still celebrating what you're becoming. And above all, you can begin again. As many times as you need to. I did. And I'm still here. Still standing. Still Serena. And for the first time, that feels like enough.